Things are changing fast. I mean, think about just the last 25 years. The 20 to 25 years, the things that have changed during that time. From a cultural standpoint, from a technological standpoint, here's just a handful of things that have changed substantially over the last 20 to 25 years. Now, for those of you that are maybe in middle school or high school, this will be a little bit of a history lesson for some of you. For the rest of you, you might be able to relate how much things have changed in the short period of time. Let's explore things like music, for example, music and albums. Some of you may have had one of these. They were called cassette tapes. And you had a cassette deck that you could put this tape in, and it was fantastic. I mean, you usually did have either a number 2 pencil or a Bic pen, so that when this happened and the cassette just kind of went all over the place, you could quickly kind of wrap it back up, and it was the way that you would listen to your favorite album. How many of you had one of those? Or then there was this, we moved forward, and there were CDs. And I'll never forget having my first Discman and the ability to be able to take this CD of my favorite album and to be able to drop MC Hammer in, close it, and listen to it all the way through while I'm dancing around. And the batteries would last you for a good 3 to 4 hours. And it was incredible because you no longer had to rewind your cassette tape, but you could listen to the album and you could skip to whatever song you wanted to. And then there was this guy named Steve Jobs, and he created this little thing called the iPod. And this just blew our mind because now you could have multiple albums in one device. You could create things like playlists, and you could go through and listen to your favorite songs by various artists at whatever time you wanted to. You could recharge the thing, and the battery actually lasted a fairly long time, and it was completely life-changing for some of us. And now you fast forward to today, and now you can essentially stream any song that you could possibly think of at any point on so many different platforms. That's just one example. Here's another one. Let's look at things like research. How many of you remember going to a place called the library? There was this thing called the Dewey Decimal System, and you had to learn where the different books were placed. And so you're doing research on a certain topic, and you would have to spend all this time putting all these books out, going through, highlighting, possibly making photocopies of these things, and taking all these notes down so that you could do your research paper. And sometimes you would spend hours in this place where you weren't allowed to talk. And then if you were one of the maybe more the well-to-do families, you had a little thing called the Britannica Encyclopedias. Now, some of you may have had these on a shelf in your house, and it went from A to Z, and it was fantastic because you could go to it, and you could pull out this one album, you could flip to whatever the topic may be, and you could do the research there in the comfort of your home. And it was so much nicer than going to the library. And nowadays, you just do things like, you just Google it. You just look it up and Google a word, and then Wikipedia or Google will take you to wherever it is that you need to go. Here's another example, things like movies. How many of you had one of these at your home? The VCR. And it was great until the power went off, right? And then you said that blinking 12. They just constantly blinked until you went. How many of you were the ones that were compulsive and you had to go and fix the 12 o'clock every time it started blinking? Some of you had to do that, right? They said things like be kind, rewind when you would go and rent these movies because you constantly had to rewind them or fast forward them. And then this mind-blowing thing came out called the DVD. And the DVD, you had this disc with a menu on it, and you could choose from any of the scenes that you wanted to go to, and you could go directly to it, and then you could watch the DVD. Now, for those of you that were very progressive, or maybe you're having a difficult time letting go of the past, there were things like the VCR and DVD combo. How many of you had one of these? And you could have a little bit of both, right? So you could watch a DVD, or you could watch your VHS tapes that you had held on to, because, that's what you did. Now, fast forward to today, then we had places like Blockbuster. How many of you remember Blockbuster? Blockbuster used to be this event that you went to, right? And it was kind of your go-to where you would go and you would rent every one of these movies. And then Blockbuster went away, and then now we do things like this where we can just simply stream, whether it's Netflix, Hulu, whatever your platform may be, and you can stream anything at any time. Let's do one more just for fun. How many of you had one of these phones at your house when you were growing up? You had a rotary phone, and maybe it was attached, maybe it was on a table, maybe it was attached to the wall, and you would dial your friends, right? And you didn't really like the friends that had a lot of nines or zeros in the number because you had to dial all the way around and wait for it to go around. And then if you messed up, you had to start over, right? It was horrible. And then your brother or your sister would inevitably pop onto the phone, and there could only be one person on the phone at a time, and they would be talking or they'd be listening to your phone calls. And it was kind of annoying, or you had this beeping later on. You're like, well, what's beeping? What's going on the other side of this phone? And so we fast forward a little bit, and we had these things called payphones. And payphones, you would always carry a quarter with you, right? Because your parents wanted to know where you were, and you always had a quarter with you in case of an emergency. I remember going to college, and we only had a couple of these in the dorm room, and there would be a line for people waiting to use these things called a payphone. And then Julie and I got married. When Julie and I got married, she had a bag phone. There was literally this bag that she would plug into her cigarette lighter. And after we got married, that thing wasn't working so well anymore, and so we went and we splurged and we got one of these. And these things were unbelievable. There was no cables. There were no quarters that you had to insert into it. I think the cost of the phone was rather pricey, and you got, I remember paying $30 a month for 30 minutes, right? And this thing was kind of your emergency thing. I mean, it had this horrific sound when it started up that would kind of freak you out. I mean, this is the noise this thing makes when you power on and power off. And it was for emergencies only, so you only had 30 minutes. Then later on, you got free nights and weekends. Do you remember this? This is before texting was really happening. And you would have this call, and it was literally having this conversation. You'd hurry and have it. You're watching your phone to make sure that you don't go over the 1 minute allotted for that day, and then you're powering off and you're moving on. And what's crazy is this is all in the last span of the 20 to 25 years. And now everything that I've listed on here is available to you at any time in a smartphone that you probably have either in your pocket or in your purse. Things are changing fast. And so as a church, as we look to reach more people in the shortest time, we have to look at things like technology and figure out, okay, how do we leverage this? How do we use this to reach more people? We're in the series called Decentralized. Our memory verse is found in Acts chapter 8, verse 4. If you're watching online or if you're here in the room, let's read this together. It says this: "Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went." And so the early church begins, and Jesus sends them out, and he says, go to Jerusalem, go to Judea, go to the very ends of the earth. And he goes and he sends them out. Some of you may not realize this, but one of our fastest growing campus has become our online campus. Because people are using things like technology where people are busy and they have different things going on, and for whatever reason, the online campus is a way for people to connect in a way that we never thought possible. And there's some people that are a little freaked out about it. They wonder what that means. And for the longest time, it really was this online world that was kind of out here off in space, like in the Matrix. And then there was the real world. And whether we like it or not, or whether we want to believe it, the truth is this, is that the online world is the real world. If you have kids in high school or even in college, they have not known a world without the internet. It's been a part of what they know. It's what they've grown up with, and it's a part of who they are. It's everywhere that you go now. There's no longer this dial-up modem that takes you 5 minutes just to get online. It's accessible all the time, any time. And so we have a choice. We can choose to embrace this, and we can figure out how to leverage it, or we can tend to freak out, which is what some people do. And so here's some things to not do. Here's some things that you should not be doing. The first one is to freak out. I think that sometimes we do. We're like, well, what does this online church mean, and what does this mean for us? And is all this going away? What does this mean? And my encouragement to you is don't freak out. Here's another thing to not do is don't fear. There's this tendency to become fearful of the unknown, and oftentimes people do fear the things that they don't fully understand. Here's another thing to not do is to fret over it. I hear people fret over this often, and my challenge to you is to don't fret over what this looks like for us to decentralize the church, because I think it will allow us to reach many more people. But here's some things that you can do instead. Here's some things to do. The first thing is to simply embrace it. Is to realize that our online campus is our fastest growing campus, and pray with us and help us figure out what does this look like when it comes to reaching more people for Him. Here's another thing that you can do is you can encourage it. For people that you know that may be traveling, for people that may not have access to be able to get here, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but figure out how to embrace it. And the last one is this, is figure out how to experiment with it. How many of you in here have watched the online service before at some point? The majority of you have at some point. And it's an incredible resource that allows us to reach more people, because the internet is all over the place. It's not like there's a limited amount of it. We have access to it anywhere that we are, and it impacts the way that we live. I mean, think of how much the internet has changed what we do. I mean, can you imagine yourself 25 years ago shopping online? Do you remember the first time you entered your credit card to buy something online and you were freaked out because you thought that your identity had immediately been stolen? But now we do things like shopping online all the time. Think of things like social media, people that maybe you lost contact with, that you haven't talked to for a very long time, and social media has allowed you to connect with these people for the very first time, and maybe even in more real time than ever possible, because you're able to connect with friends and families at a much quicker pace. Think of even things like online dating. I mean, do you remember that 25 years ago, online dating was a joke? Right? Like it was a punchline of a lot of jokes that were taking place. I'll never forget the first time somebody told me, when I asked them how they met, they said that they met online. And I laughed, and I was like, no, seriously, how'd you guys meet? And then they looked at me and they're like, no, we really met online. And then it wasn't so funny anymore. What's interesting now is that when you ask a lot of people how they met, online is actually a very typical response. Because people aren't going and hanging out at these dirty, dingy bars anymore trying to find somebody. They're using things like online dating sites or other ways to be able to connect with people. And so we can choose to do these things, or we can choose to do these other things, and you have to decide at some point, are you going to embrace it or are you going to reject it? Because the reality is that for some, this has caused fear. This has caused worry. This has caused doubt for, well, what does this mean for my church that I've always known? What does this mean for us as a church? Are things completely changing? It's nothing new. It's something that's happened throughout history. Things have changed as people change. And there's always a tendency to worry about something. And in Jesus' day, there was a group of people that Jesus is addressing that were worried about something completely different. And Jesus addresses it with them, and he says, well, why are you worried about these things? This is what it says in Matthew chapter 6, verse 25. It says, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Jump down to verse 31. And so do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For pagans run around after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. Verse 33, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. And so we can choose to be fearful. We can choose to be against it. We can choose to worry about it, or we can choose to seek God as to what this might mean for you and for me. I mean, listen, I can't imagine what Paul would have done on these missionary journeys had he had access to things like the internet, to be able to reach out to all these people. I mean, we're in a point in history where we have access to so many things at any time, anywhere. And as a church, we have to rethink, what does this mean for us? If the online world is the real world, what does this mean for you and for me? And how do we as a church better leverage it? I think another important thing to remember is that the churches are always changing because people are always changing. I mean, I think it's true that the churches are always changing because people are always changing. Now, think of the early church for just a moment. Not the early church in the book of Acts, but the early church here in America. People come here, and in the 1800s, there's all these churches that are starting all over the place. And they're specific to these communities. I mean, you drive through Boston, drive around different areas, and you'll find these churches, and oftentimes sometimes they're only half a mile apart, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little bit less. And there were all these different churches that often popped up, and they were kind of tied into this geographical area. And it was tied into to kind of a core set of beliefs that were specific maybe for the culture, what was happening. Well, keep in mind that it wasn't until the late 1800s, early 1900s, where people even had access to things like automobiles. So people weren't traveling around to all these different places. So many of the churches were congregated around these different communities. And people's life was kind of based around coming to this central place, this central location where things were happening. And so the truth is that there wasn't really this bar that was set super high of this has to be done with excellence, that this has to be done well, or that the building has to be in phenomenal shape, even though there were some beautiful buildings in those days. But the reality is that it was your social circle. It was how you connected. You went to a specific place, a location to get connected, oftentimes based on denominational expressions or geographical locations, because that was their identity. The challenge was that oftentimes churches that refuse to change ultimately begin to die. And the sad truth is that oftentimes many of these powerful movements of Jesus, these things that were powerful movement of Jesus at one point, are simply now museums. Because they refuse to change, they refuse to think about how they could possibly maybe reinvent themselves in order to reach more people that were far from Christ. The truth is that people are attending church physical locations less and less often than ever before. I mean, even good, close followers of Jesus oftentimes are attending church 1 to 2 times a month. And I don't think it's because people love Jesus less. I think it's that we figured out other ways to be able to engage with one another. You're inviting people to your home, or you're going to somebody's house, or you're gathered at a certain place, or there's no longer this need to always congregate in one single location. And things are changing fast, and we need to look at what this means for you and for me. I mean, now we have access to more podcasts, more messages, more books than ever in history. Before, when you were going to church, it was you were going on sometimes Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night because you wanted to be aware of everything that was taking place there. That was the only way for you to gather information. Things like communication were not a big thing in the 1800s. That had happened to much later on. And so as a church, we need to think of what this looks like. Now, let me be really clear here, because there's some of you that are like about to freak out, like, well, what does this mean for me? Jeremy, just tell me what this means. I want to tell you this is the truth, is that the methods are many, principles are few. Methods are always changing, but principles rarely do. Let me say that one more time. Methods are many, principles are few. Methods are always changing, principles rarely do. I always become a little fearful when someone tells me how much they love a methodology, a way that something is being done. Because I often tell them, like, well, it's working now, and we're thankful that it's working now, but there's a really good chance that the method is going to change, even though the principles and the core of what we believe will not. And so when we read things in Hebrews, like Hebrews 10, verse 23 through 25, it says this. It says, let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habits of doing, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day approaching. The way that we continue to encourage and spur one another on, and the way that we meet will probably look different than it did before. Though the core of what we believe, the core of what we teach will not change. As we're praying for one, we often talk about, as we're praying for one, we talk about connecting to God and to people and the mission of Jesus Christ. And the reason we pray for one is because we want God's love to flow through us out to the rest of the world. When Jesus was asked, what are the most important commandments, he kind of summarized it all up in this way. He said, it's simply loving the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, with all of your strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. And so at the core of what we believe, the core of our principles will not change, though the methodology and the way that we go about doing it probably will, as you're seeing it is. It's evolving and it's changing. One of my favorite passages, and one of the reasons I went into ministry is found in Matthew chapter 9, verse 36. Some of you have heard this passage before. This is what it says in Matthew chapter 9. It says, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in the synagogues, proclaiming the good news and the kingdom, and healing every disease. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples this, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are what? Few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to what? To send out workers into his harvest field. Living in this region, we know that the harvest is huge. We know that the need is incredible. There's so many people that are far from Jesus. It's why we ask every one of you to pray for one. Because if you're not praying for one, it won't take long before you want to kind of do something else. And the reason we're constantly praying for one is because we believe it's at the center of the heart of God. It's a principle that we stick closely to. But as the harvest continues to grow rapidly and increasingly, and there's a huge harvest that needs to be reaped, we need to look at how we as a church better reach that harvest. Those people that are far from Jesus, how do we reach them? How do we as a church go to where this harvest is? Because so much of what we're doing on a weekly basis often does change. I'll give you an example is things like serving. You may not realize this, but the entire worship team that was up here and the people that are running production and the cameras and everything else kind of behind the scenes, there's only a couple of these people that are on staff. Everybody else here volunteers. And so please don't hear that your role as a volunteer doesn't matter or that roles of volunteers are going away. Somebody told me that last week, and I was like, no, what are you talking about? Roles of volunteers are not going away. The way that you serve in the church is not going away. I mean, we have hundreds of people that serve every single week. But for some of you, serving may look a little bit different. Maybe some of you aren't currently serving in the church, and God is calling you to serve in a different way to help reach this harvest. Because sadly, too often times we see people love their methodology so much more than the mission of Jesus. We don't want to simply become consumers. We want to become people who are senders and people who are helping reach people that are far from Christ. And so what does that look like for you and for me? How do we creatively explore ways where we can serve in different capacities? And some of those may be here in the church and some of those may be elsewhere, but what does that look like for you and me? Here's another point is a decentralized church allows us to have more worship services in more places. If you've been reading through the book Decentralized, Bo talks about this, that a decentralized church allows us to have more worship services in more places. Because it's what we feel like we need to do. I mean, yes, we want to continue to have buildings and we want to continue to have different ways to be able to reach people, but it has to change. The way that we reach people that are far from Him, it has to change. The entire Pray for One model is focusing on God, on people, and the mission of Jesus. And so the entire gospel is really centered around Jesus comes here and He dies for us. And as he's teaching them the best possible way to live, and He says, love God and love others and love others as yourself. And then He gives them this great commission, which is about the missional portion of what we are constantly about. And is this thing He calls the Great Commission. This is what it says in Matthew chapter 28. It says, then the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw Him, they worshiped Him, but some what? doubted. If you're ever doubting, just know that you're in good company. I mean, these people were with Jesus for 3 years. They saw him die, raise, and it says that some of them still doubted. Verse 18, then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in the heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, the key word is what? Go. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. You see, at some point there was this shift. And Jesus clearly says, go and make disciples. And at some point we turned it to come to us. Like if you would just come to a physical location, then you can come to know Jesus and you can come to be a disciple of his. But Jesus clearly said it's time for us to go. It's time for us as believers to not only come to worship in places like this, which, like I said, worship in these places is not going away. But how do we as followers of him go to places that people may not have yet heard of Jesus? I think it begins with asking some different questions. We have to think about things a little differently than we have before. And so here's some better questions that I think we can ask. The first one is this, is who are you trying to reach? As you're praying for one, who are you specifically trying to reach? Another question is this, is what do you need? If there's somebody specifically that you are trying to reach, maybe God has put them on your heart, God is clearly saying to you, you need to go and you need to reach out to this person, then my question to you is what do you need from us? What do you need from the church? How can we as a church help you? How can we empower you? How can we send you so that you can maybe reach these people that we have yet to reach? Here's another question, is how can we help? How can we help you? How can we empower you to be able to reach your ones, to be able to reach people that maybe you know are far from Jesus, but nobody has yet to reach them? Because I think the call for some is going to be different. I mean, the call for some to go it is going to continue to be, you go to church and there will be a physical location and that's what you've thought of church. And like I said, physical locations are not going away. And so some people will continue to go to church and the church will be your church home and the way that you do church will be the way that you've always done church. And listen, that's okay. For some of you, bringing your ones to church is the best thing to do. But for some of you, you need to go to places like homes. Your ones may never come to a church building, or maybe they've said that they would never come to a church building because the building's going to burn down. How many of you have friends that have said that? But maybe they'll come to your home. Maybe you can invite them to be a part of an online service where you can have an interaction with them, where they can ask questions, where you can maybe even pray with them. You can have a conversation that maybe you weren't able to have if they were to come to church. Maybe some of you need to go to your neighborhoods. Maybe just the neighborhood that you're in right now, and you've been praying for ones. Maybe they're your neighbors, and you've been praying for them. And so what would it look like for you to go and to reach the neighborhood that you're living in? How do things change? How does the way that you share God's love with other people change if you begin to look at it as, okay, well, I need to go to a neighborhood? Or maybe some of you simply need to go to surrounding communities. Maybe some of you just simply need to make us aware of other surrounding communities that don't maybe have a place for people to gather and worship. And we would love to come alongside and partner with them. Probably very few of you know the story of this church right here. We're at the Bedford campus right now. And years ago, there was a church here, a small church called Bedford Community Church. And at one point, they realized that together we would be better than they were by themselves. And so they came to us and they approached us and they asked if they could merge with us, and they became Manchester Christian Church. And because of that, because of going to a surrounding community and being aware of a need, we were able to partner with them, and you right now are able to worship in this space because of that partnership. Please listen to this if you've maybe tuned out through everything else because you're like, this is not for me. If you are aware, whether you're online or whether you're in the room, if you are aware of a surrounding community that is interested in partnering with us to reach people that are far from him, then let us know. Call us, email us. If you're online, type it in. We would love to know what that opportunity is so that together we can partner and we can reach more people, regardless of how we go about doing it. Some of you may be thinking of places like prisons where people physically can't come to a location. And so do you know what we want to do? We want to go to them. Places like nursing homes, shut-ins, people where they may physically not be able to leave. If you know ways that we can connect with them, then we want to go to them and share the gospel with them so that they can come to know the same love that you and I have come to know, which is Jesus Christ giving his life for us. Because, church, the goal doesn't change. It's reaching more people in the shortest time. We just want to leverage things like technology to be able to do so. I want to read you the last page of the last chapter of chapter 3, which is the real world. If you haven't picked up a copy, you can get these before you leave. It says this: the internet is the real world. Real people make real connections and do real things all day, every day online. If you're serious about the mission of Jesus and truly want to go into all the world, then we will go online. We will decentralize. We will send people instead of holding people. We will change and the real world will be reached. And I think when Jesus said to us, we need to go and into all the world, it looks a little different than it may have in his day. And as we go into this time of communion, I want you to realize that all these different places that we're going to go, all these different people that we try to reach, the same Jesus Christ gave his life for each and every one of those people that have yet to come to know him. And church, we're called to go. We're called to go and reap this harvest that's plentiful. And so as we reflect on this time of communion, let's remember the sacrifice that he's made for us. God sends his one and only Son, lives the perfect life, teaches us to love others better, teaches us about the importance of loving God and having a relationship with him, about what it means to truly serve and to give your life away. So I want you to join me in this prayer as we close out and go into a time of communion. God, would you show us how to reach more people in more places in the shortest time? Father, would you give us courage to go and do what you've called us to do? Father, as the church decentralizes, Father, we pray that you help us reach more people by more means in the shortest time. We love you, Father. We ask you this in your name.